Now I'm excited to welcome back for her second appearance at an RAA event, and I'm glad we didn't scare you off the first time, Savanthi Syth, who is Managing Director of Global Airlines at Raymond James. We always appreciate that you lend us your insight, and you've asked such insightful questions on earnings calls, and I know most of you listen to them. I know I do. Savi has worked with Raymond James for more than 12 years, and prior to that, Wells Capital Management and Strong Capital. Savi's known for insightful questions to airline leaders and her depth of knowledge in aviation. So I know that we all eagerly read everything that you put out, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. So please join me in welcoming Savi.
Thanks, Faye. All right, good afternoon, everyone. That was two kind words from Faye. I'm gonna, if you see me fiddling with the watch, I just want to make sure I talk short enough that you have a chance for Q&A. You know, if Mark was Captain Obvious, I think I might be Captain Repeat. Though if you're looking for captains, I would not be the right one. If nothing else, I love turbulence. So I'll be the one who's seeking the turbulent routes, and your passengers will not be happy. So, as Faye mentioned, I've followed the from a financial perspective, this regional airline industry for almost a couple of decades now, and I've actually had the good fortune to also work earlier in my career with somebody you might know, Jim Parker, who's also followed this industry for a very long time, and have gained great insights from him. So. Second thing I would actually like you to know about me is I'm generally an optimist. And it's very bad. It is actually a hazard for me in my current position, because I think pessimists and skeptics are the ones who do better in the financial industry. That said, as much as an optimist I am, I'm really concerned. And I know James took us away from the pilots discussion, and I'm probably going to bring you back into that discussion. I am very concerned for the industry right now. The viability, a lot of what you've heard, and when I said I was going to be Captain Repeat, I'm going to kind of show some data around a lot of the things that we've already discussed, but maybe put some numbers around it. It's hard to fight that optimist in me, so I will say, I'll point out the silver lining here. What I've noticed kind of since pre-COVID, I think pre-COVID, the onus of addressing the pilot supply issue has been squarely on RAA members, right? And I think there is a shift. You are seeing more of the industry getting involved to try and address this issue. So that's extremely encouraging, but it's really the first minor step. And honestly, I think we're failing the government, industry, the aviation industry, the union leadership, we're all failing the flying public right now. And I think we need to come together and collaborate more deeply to address this issue. We need the FAA, we need the UAA, we need RAA, A4A, ALPA, SWAPA, the whole alphabet soup to come together and really address this. This is a problem. I might be kind of preaching to the choir here, and so there's a lot of work to need to be done, but I think we need collaboration, and unless we get that collaboration, it is going to be a long, hard winter for this industry, but more importantly for the communities that you support, that really rely on you. And I've been part of many of those communities that have relied on the regional airline industry, so I hope that we can really come together to address this. And I'm going to, the first bullet here, it's worth repeating. Like, the importance of the regional airline industry in connecting communities and supporting commerce is indisputable. I don't think that that's up for discussion right now. And I think, to repeat somebody that observed earlier, this kind of remote working is only increasing the demand for regional airline service. And this should be kind of the best time. The demand is greater than you've seen. It's a really positive environment, so we really need to kind of fix this kind of supply, mostly pilot, but we've heard about other employment opportunities as well. But it really needs to get addressed. I put in here that I think regional airlines with capacity purchase agreements might be, in the short term, a bit better situated, because at least you do have mainline partners to try and flow through those costs. And I think there's a recognition by mainline partners on how important this is. But at the end of the day, you can't find economics. And James had mentioned it. Operating costs matter, and it is going to be extremely important on how to address all of this. So if we go to the next slide, I do want to talk about demand drivers, because I think it's worth reminding ourselves, and I don't like standing behind a podium. I apologize, I'm going to walk around. I might provide some comic relief if I fall off, but bear with me. Just remind ourselves like why pilot demand is where it is today. We've talked about the 1,500-hour rule, but just fixing that is going to go a long way, but it's not enough. And so just to remind us where this all comes, one, you had the new flight duty and rest rules. And I would argue that this was probably more important to address some of the crash issues than 1,500 hours ever did. But it was an important legislation. It was an important rule update from something that was like 30 or 40 years old based on new science. And that required 5 to 10% more pilots to fly the same schedule. So that increased demand for pilots. On top of that, I think another important thing to consider is consolidation in the industry and product segmentation in the airline industry in general that has made this a profitable industry. Now I know in DC, and if you're writing for The Economist, consolidation is a 4-letter word, and that is just not true. Like you haven't created a monopoly, you haven't created an oligopoly. Just look at the margins, look at the returns. These are just good returns that you need to bring in affordable capital into the industry. And because we brought in affordable capital into the industry, those airlines are then able to invest in people, they're able to invest in product, and that drives up demand. And so what has happened is, as you can see, the first few years of this happening, as demand started coming back up after the recession, and after, this goes back to 2004, so you're talking about bankruptcies when airlines weren't making proper returns. And you've finally seen that growth in demand. You saw the mainline airlines, so the legacy air carriers, bringing back furloughed pilots initially. So this didn't really show up early stages because we had all those furloughed pilots. But now we're hiring pilots because there's strong demand, because it's a health industry, it's driving up demand. The top graph here I just wanted to show is the top is seats, and that shows you that nice seat growth that in 2019 we finally surpassed the level of seats offered in the domestic market above the 2004 level. But in terms of departure, that is a bit of an offset for pilot demand. We have been growing with larger gauge aircraft. You saw in kind of the 2012, 2013 timeframe, you had scope relief. So you are able to fly regional, more 76-seat regionals, and then also just growth in large and narrow-body aircraft in the market. And so you've seen at least departures not kind of keep up as much, which has been a bit of a relief. And then obviously the one that we've all talked about is the pilot retirement. Now we can talk about whether this is kind of a requirement or not for safety, but this is a kind of a pull on demand. You see in 2022, and this is kind of from data from SWAPA that helps us out. They do some kind of good work in kind of tracking that information. But kind of roughly 2,000 pilots in 2022, a little bit lower than we thought pre-pandemic because you saw the pull forward. But this trend is pretty consistent with what we expected pre-pandemic, which is increasingly higher retirements into the middle of the decade, and not really kind of stepping back down meaningfully until you get to the end of the decade. So these are big kind of demand pulls. So let's talk about then the supply side in the next slide. I apologize, there's a lot of data. You don't have to read that data, ignore that data. I just included in here if you wanted our kind of supporting information. But let's go to the 1,500-hour rule, because I think the goal of the rule is very commendable, but the rule itself is just completely, it just defeats the purpose and actually kind of goes against everything. And the issue here is, again, we've heard it time and time again, the emphasis on quantity over quality. And quality matters. Again, probably preaching to the choir with much here. And the thing is, it has exacerbated inequity in accessing what is a really good piloting career or a career for many. And so this 1,500-hour rule is very misguided and needs to be addressed, again, in a way that enhances safety and quality of training, and not just relying on just number of hours to say that hours equal safety. The biggest question that I have for people who defend 1,500 hours and saying, hey, if you cut it, there's a safety issue, is, look, good ideas get copied in this industry, especially if it comes to safety. right? And yes, the US has laid in a safety culture, and I'm really glad to be, flying in a market like this where there is a high regard to safety. But the thing is, there's a lot of other countries with high quality safety standards. Why hasn't the UK CAA copied the 1,500-hour rule? Why hasn't EASA copied the 1,500-hour rule? Why hasn't Transport Canada copied the 1,500-hour rule? They've had over a decade to see how effective or how not effective it is. And these are governments who are committed to, and government bodies that are committed to safety. Why haven't they copied this rule? Because it is not a safety rule. And I think that's like the biggest thing, and we need to drive home, it needs to get addressed. And why I bring it up is it is kind of constraining supply. And we all kind of know that. But fixing that rule is going to go a long way. It doesn't fix everything. Again, I think we need to have more of a discussion as to how this industry hires and the quality and the kind of the requirements and how they hire. We heard some commentary earlier about just, I think Linda, robbing Peter to pay Paul is what's happening in this industry, and it's creating a lot of that unproductive training events and hours, and we need to come together as an industry and figure out a better way to do this. And then a reminder on the pandemic, again, probably all of you know this, but you actually slowed the creation of pilots during the pandemic. You couldn't get pilots that are coming in for the 250 to 1,500, they couldn't get their hours as much. You slowed hiring at every airline because you just didn't know what demand was going to look like, and you pull forward retirements. For any organization that said that they knew demand was going to come roaring back, that is disingenuous at best. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that right now we're in this supply shock because of the pandemic, and this will kind of pass. I think where some of the reactions that we're having today is in panic to what we're seeing today, but we just need to keep in mind that some of this is a timing issue that gets addressed. And then the acceleration of e-commerce related to cargo demand, that was perverse, right? When demand for passenger service was coming down, the demand for cargo service was going up quite a bit. And I think there's a little bit of exuberance on the cargo side as well. Maybe not the last mile type of cargo, but there are a lot of airlines out there who are hiring and buying freighters and expanding their cargo capabilities that I feel like may be overshooting it as well. We cover some of the European carriers like Lufthansa, Air France. They were cutting their dedicated freighter, and now they've been growing it again. LATAM, before filing bankruptcy, they were bringing their cargo freighter down, and now their dedicated freighter is increasing. So I think there's some excitement in the cargo industry that I think will need to get right-sized as well. So because of this, we did this analysis on what pilot demand is, and I think a lot of you might disagree with us, but we think some of the estimates out there are a little too exaggerated in terms of demand, because most of I think the demand is considered on kind of growth metrics of what people want to grow, and what people will likely be able to grow is a whole different thing. You have to kind of take all of the different economics into mind. So I'm not saying we're right. We just did a back of the envelope, as if you saw the trend pre-crisis and kind of extended it and there was no pandemic. These are the number of pilots that we need. We needed close to 14,000 pilots this year. Clearly don't have the training infrastructure to get there. And this is across mainline. When I say mainline, legacy, LCC, ULCC, as well as cargo carriers, some of the bigger cargo carriers. And so we came up with, probably needed 14,000. You probably don't have the training capacity for that. So if you look at next year, having to catch up for what you didn't do this year, we have around 8,000 pilots being hired next year. And then we have around kind of 6,000 pilots in 2024 plus, growing at like a less than 5% rate. Now that is about 2,000 pilots a year, lower than some of the more estimates that are out there. I'm not saying I'm smarter. This is a back of the envelope. You guys are a lot more smarter about this. But one thing I would consider is, from a demand perspective, what we want to grow and what we can grow are two different things. So if you go to the next slide. Necessity is the mother of invention. When I put the slides together last week, I was a little bit more optimistic than I am today. Within the last 24 hours, the development on the FAA front and Republic has been very disappointing, actually. And maybe I was a little too Pollyanna-ish on the government wanting to really address this in a very data-focused manner. But I am still going to be optimistic because there are a lot more, like I said before, a lot more industry participants coming at this and coming with different solutions to try and address the issues. I won't go through all of this, and the solutions, again, high quality. It really kind of gives you hope that these are kind of high quality solutions, that we're going to have a better quality pilot out there, and it's going to do the flying public a benefit, and it's going to do pilots themselves a benefit, as if they get this kind of quality training that all these different solutions are coming after. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I feel the regional pilot pay increases that we're seeing today is just short-sighted. I feel like it's partially in reaction to again, what I felt was a kind of 12 to 18 month super crunch in the pilot supply. We weren't expecting the supply situation to go away, but there is this kind of intense supply issue right now that is probably creating some very short-sighted responses, and the pilot pay is one of them. Look, pilot pay had to go up. We are asking individuals to spend more time to come into a Part 121 career, so that pilot pay had to go up, but the level that it has gone up has just overshot in terms of what is feasible. So just to kind of drive that point home, and actually the next slide shows you why this is. So this is for capacity purchase agreement operators, so you don't have fuel in here, but half of your operating costs are salaries, wages and benefits, and half of that is pilots. So a quarter of your costs are being driven by pilot wages. So let's look at what happened with pilot wages. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to explain this a little bit. What we have is a mainline maximum in 2013, what the mainline minimum was in 2013. So this would be either a Delta or a Southwest, and this would be an Allegiant type airline. So the ultra low cost carrier is the mainline minimum, and then you have what a regional airline pilot pay was. We had SkyWest for 2013, so we used that. And then the blue section is what it is today. And you can see a significant increase. And go back to, again, this is an industry that's profitable now. We can invest in our pilots. And so pilot pay has gone up across the board. On an inflation-adjusted basis, we brought pilot pay back up to levels that you saw pre-bankruptcy era, after seeing like 50% cuts. No other industry have you seen pay being restored to levels back in the 1990s, despite kind of all the improvements in technology. So this is what a profitable industry can do. So pilot pay was going up, but the biggest concern here is that pay differential between regionals and the lowest mainline. As you can see, it used to be about 50%. Now it's less than 8%. And yes, mainline pilot agreements are getting renewed, so this gap will widen again. But they're getting renewed not by 40%. We think they're going up maybe 15% in this next round over the next couple of years. And so this gap is still going to be meaningfully lower than it has been historically. And this is first-year captain. The next slide has fifth-year captain. So I've kind of focused on the junior pilots, first officers and captains. And that shows you again that it's so starkly kind of visually, you can see how much that gap has narrowed. And you can see, it used to be 47% gap versus the lowest, and now it's kind of 14%. The next slide is probably more telling. This is a first-year first officer making almost as much money as flying at a legacy airline, first-year first officer. Well above what you can get flying for an ultra-low-cost carrier. This is nuts from an economic standpoint. You're 75%, you're not 50% below, you're 75% above. This makes no sense from an economic standpoint, and I'll explain why in a bit. Like, I think my guess is the regional airline industries are going to look at it as you're now going to convince your pilots to stay with you instead of going to a ULCC, and then you can go up to a legacy carrier, so you might get some stability. But at the end of the day, you really have unit economics that you have to work with. So if you go on to the next slide, oh, sorry, and this is the fifth-year first officer, still pretty close to a ultra-low-cost carrier. And then in the next slide, we talk about, this. One of the results is going to be, yes, if the regional industry is going to use higher pilot pay to keep pilots with the airline before moving on to a legacy carrier, then what you're going to see is the ultra low-cost carriers become the farm team now too. You're going to see more competition from ultra low-cost carriers. I don't think they're going to significantly increase their pay above regional airline. I think the response is going to be they're going to go directly to the colleges and the schools and start developing the pilots themselves. It will increase the cost to them. They'll have to improve their training programs. But now you're a lot more head-to-head competition with ultra low-cost carriers. And again, it goes back to this gauge disadvantage. An ultra low-cost carrier is competing with 180. They might not be competing in the same markets, but they are competing with 180 to 220 seats. And so if a 50-seat regional airline, to have the same unit profitability as a ultra low-cost carrier, you have to claim fares that are 3.5 to 4 times higher than an ultra low-cost carrier. In a 76-seat, that's 2.5 times. It's really hard to see outside of specific, very rare circumstances where a 50-seat airline or a 50-seat aircraft could be economical in this environment. There are going to be a few markets where the passengers are paying really high fares, but it's going to be few and far between. And if you go to the next slide, I don't want to forget jets. I don't have a crystal ball. This is our Raymond James airline industry airline team forecast. I don't have a crystal ball, but it doesn't look like fuel is going to come down anytime soon, given the conflicts around the geopolitical issues. I know we have a recession coming around the corner, but we also still have geopolitical issues that are going to balance it out. So we might have a recession where you don't see the same kind of pullback in fuel costs that you've seen in the past. We'll see. But our forecast doesn't have jet fuel coming back to 2019 levels until the end of 2024. And so this is going to be another important factor. And again, going back to that 50-seater, that's, on a per unit basis, fuel is much more of a drag on a 50-seater than it is on a 76-seater, than it is on a narrow-body aircraft. If you go on to the next slide, this has been the trend in the US market. This is domestic seat share by fleet type. And you've seen kind of the bottom one is the turboprops, has been coming down. I think it's stabilized a little bit, and I think that's a function of fuel and maybe Part 135 operations. And if you look at the small RJs, they've been shrinking and shrinking. And I think that is going to continue to shrink in this environment. Again, maybe in some of the charter operations, we can see some of those small RJs still working. But in Part 121 normal operations, I think that's going to continue to shrink. And then the next one is large RJs. I suspect we're going to keep the large RJs. I suspect we probably want more large RJs if you had the pilots to fly them. I think airlines like them. They support communities. At best, that stays steady. It doesn't grow. And maybe we can get some of the parked aircraft back, but it's going to take time. And I think you're just going to have the dark blue is narrow bodies, and I think they're going to continue to take on more share. And like the wide bodies are on top, and they've kind of gone back and forth. You saw wide bodies kind of blip up here in 2021 when you couldn't fly internationally, so you flew it domestically. But I think the share of wide body in the domestic market's going to be pretty small. It just does not make sense. So if you go to the next slide, so you say a narrow body, okay, so we fly more narrow bodies. But the fact is, there are a lot of communities that cannot support narrow body aircraft. And I think we saw some stats earlier today about how many small cities have lost service since the pandemic. And this is the number of airports served by American, Delta, United, including with their regional partners. And that is a clear direction here, and it is down. You saw United really step up pre-pandemic. The blue bars are pre-pandemic, and the green bars are post-pandemic. I left out 2020. Try not to think about 2020. So, United came out in 2016 with, hey, we're going to have great service, we're going to have a bigger domestic footprint, and we're going to be competitive with American and Delta. And then you saw the update middle of last year where they're like, yeah, we changed our minds. That's not the plan. There's kind of a better way to do this, and those small markets are probably not going to work, just given what they saw in the longer term. But clearly the direction is lower. I think we looked at 4Q 23, and there are 10 more cities that have lost service. And that we're probably not stopping there. We're going to lose a lot more service. And then if you go to the next slide, this is where I will try to be hopeful again. Pilot supply solutions being implemented today will bear fruit. There is things that are happening. It's a 3-year runway at least. At some point, they start to bear fruit, and the LIFT program, the Aviate program, all of those are going to start to bear fruit and bring quality pilots in here. Low probability solutions, scope relief, probably not. And again, until we get the pilots, it doesn't matter if you get scope relief, though you might be able to move some of those 50-seaters. Repeal of the 1,500-hour rule. I don't think you'd repeal the whole rule, but you do need to address this quality versus quantity issue. And clearly, the latest update is not very encouraging. And technology advances. So we recently expanded our coverage into the advanced air mobility sector. I'll tell you, about a year and a half ago, I started looking at this sector, and I went into it with a lot of skepticism. For an optimist, I was fairly skeptic. I was thinking we're going to look at this, and it's going to be this science experiment. But I'm telling you, what we've seen in that sector is I think it's going to come in sooner than a lot of people realize. And it's a combination of, there was some silly capital that went into that industry. The SPAC craze really, I think, changed the dial here. You've got technology advancing, but you've also had this amount of capital that's flowed in that's attracted a lot of smart people, and we're going to get some really interesting solutions. So the eVTOL, UAM space, I agree earlier, that's not going to replace regional flying. That's just inner city flying. But maybe that gives you some of that pilot supply, that pilot training to help bridge that gap and help people fund their education or fund their hours to get into the Part 121. Electrification, including hybrid, you've seen some discussion here. You heard Embraer and you had Pratt & Whitney talk about it. It reduces the fuel cost. I think that these are going to be really meaningful solutions that really drive the next leg of growth for this industry longer term. And then remote operations. I think if you move the pilot off of the cockpit into the seat, I think Brian might not agree. He might still want to be in the cockpit and enjoy flying. But you do kind of increase kind of the quality of life. You increase accessibility into the profession. And over time, you could improve productivity. That's really a long ways away. But again, this is like looking forward as to the things that you can, and you might see this in cargo much sooner than you see it in passenger. And if you see it in cargo, that does help passenger because it does kind of free up some more pilots. But again, those are long term, but the electrification, or at least a hybrid, and the eVTOL is probably not as far as you think. Before the end of the decade, I think we'll see, not ubiquitous, you're not going to see 1,000 of those flying overhead, but I think you're going to start to see them really gain traction and see them flying around. So with that, if you go to the next slide, just a reminder, when I moved to the sell side, I went through and read SkyWest 10Ks back to 1995 and built my fleet models, and I remember they had Metroliners in 1995 was the big aircraft that they were flying. Then the Embraer 130, and then some of the Embraer and CRJ aircraft that you see flying today. And again, I think eVTOL, and apologies to Embraer, I had to choose pictures that were common license, and so I couldn't bring up any Embraer or Eve aircraft here, but this is the Hart aircraft, and that's Archer aircraft. Again, I think these are kind of the next generation. The optimist in me thinks we do, this industry is going to grow again. The question is, how long is the pain going to be? With that, I have a few minutes for Q&A if you have any questions. Thank you. If not, I'll leave you with one quick story. So in the early 1990s, scientists kind of created a mini version of our planet called Biosphere 2, if you remember. The goal of this was to kind of learn how to grow plants better. And one thing the scientists found is the plants in the Biosphere 2 grew up much quicker than the outside world, but then fell over before they had a chance to mature. And what they figured out is, without wind, the trees weren't developing stress wood. And so there's this different cellulosic structure that requires, that helps with the load bearing. So the point is, without wind, not only are trees not as strong as they should be, it's really important to their very survival. So if anything, given all the challenges you're facing, I hope you look at this as a win that builds your stress fibers, and it makes you load bearing for the long term. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Savi, I can't thank you enough for those remarks and for your dose of, I would say, realistic optimism and for your encouragement. Really very, very helpful.